Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about environmental agreements and organisations in A-level politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of the specification this video covers, and some key 12 markers and 30 markers you could be asked on this topic in your A-level politics exam. From there, I'm going to have a look at the key international frameworks to tackle climate change, including the IPCC and the UNFCCC. From there, I'm going to look at international agreements to tackle climate change, from the Rio Earth Summit and the Kyoto Protocol through to the Paris Agreement, before looking at the strengths and weaknesses of international agreements in tackling climate change. From there, I'm going to look at some recent conferences and developments, including recent COPs, including the most recent one in Baku, and important developments to international efforts to tackle climate change over the past decade, before finally looking at the efforts of other organisations and groups to tackling climate change, including regional organisations, global civil society, and other organisations and groups. So, in terms of the parts of specification this video covers, so this is the third of 4 videos on the channel on the third subtopic of global politics, and that's global governance, human rights, and environmental. So we've done the first 2 videos on human rights, that was human rights courts and humanitarian intervention, so make sure to look at those. And this video and the next one is going to be on environmental global governance. So as the specification shows, this is going to be on the role and significance of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the IPCC, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of international agreements, including Rio, Kyoto, Copenhagen and Paris, before finally looking at the role and significance of global civil society and non-state actors in tackling climate change and supporting the environment. In terms of some key essay questions you get on this topic, so as I mentioned in previous videos, all of the questions in bold you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, detailed plans for them, both 12 marker plans and 30 marker plans. And if you know all of these questions well, not only are they likely to come up in the exam, there's some quite likely questions, you can also adapt them. If you know the content really well, you can adapt that content to answer pretty much any question that's going to come up in the exam. In terms of some possible 12 markers that could come up, you could be asked to look at the differences or similarities between the key organisations, so the UNFCCC and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You could also be asked about different perspectives on the environment and climate change, which are going to be in the next video on debate. So that's where you look at the kind of shallow green ecology, sustainable development, tragedy of the commons as well. And you can bring in some of the content from this video into questions potentially you could get on the division between the developed and the developing world on the responsibility to tackling climate change. In terms of the essay questions you could get asked, you could get a general question on the effectiveness of global environmental governance. I think that's quite a likely question where you're going to bring in stuff from this video and the next video. You could also potentially get something on the effectiveness of international agreements on climate change as well. So lots of different questions that this content can be really useful. So it's really useful and important to know it well. Starting off then by looking at international frameworks to tackle climate change. And the first key one of these is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is an international panel of scientists focused on climate change. It was formed in 1988 due to growing awareness that climate change is a global crisis that required coordinated scientific research and policy guidance for governments. It doesn't conduct its own research. Instead, it effectively looks at all the research and synthesizes it, brings it together, and produces reports and recommendations to policymakers and governments worldwide for tackling climate change. Its primary work centers around its assessment reports, which are published every 6 to 7 years, and special reports in between that focus on urgent topics such as global warming thresholds, oceans, and land use. And these reports, especially the assessment reports, enable the IPCC to inform and influence climate policy whilst communicating the urgency of the climate crisis both to governments and to the public. In terms of its impact and significance, it's had a really big influence on how the world views and responds to climate change, especially in raising global awareness of how important it is as a crisis and how important it is that the international community takes it seriously and tackles it. So it's warning, for example, that global warming beyond 1.5 degrees could lead to an irreversible environmental and social consequences, has greatly intensified the focus on mitigation, and on the second point, informed international agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. For example, the fourth assessment report in 2007 highlighted the importance of setting or keeping global warming well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. And that was reflected in the Paris Agreement's target, which was exactly the same. Of course, the IPCC doesn't just influence international agreements, it's also influenced national policies, as it's such a respected scientific advisory body. It's used by countries to inform their domestic climate policies, such as the UK's Climate Change Act of 2008, which set legally binding targets for emissions reductions and used the IPCC findings as justification for that, both to the public and to Parliament. Finally, the IPCC, by stressing the importance of tackling climate change and the scale of the crisis, has also mobilised public opinion to tackle climate change. This being said, the IPCC can also be seen as limited in some ways, as it lacks enforcement powers. So it really does depend, as we looked at actually in some of the human rights clause, on voluntary action by governments to implement its suggestions, which shows the limitations of international organisations as a whole. Further, its reports can sometimes be seen as conservative and slow to reflect new scientific findings. For example, its fifth assessment report in 2014 was criticised for underestimating the potential sea level rise, which was later updated in 2019. If we have a look specifically then on the impact of recent IPCC reports. So in 2018, there was a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, and this influential report highlighted the critical differences in impacts between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees in rising global temperatures. And it warned that even half a degree of additional warming would substantially increase risks related to extreme weather events, sea level rises, food insecurity, and habitat loss. And that's potentially in response, actually, in part to the Paris Agreement, which saying it wants to get it as low as possible, close to 1.5 degrees, but said 2 degrees is the limit. So the IPCC is potentially, in doing this, trying to get the international community to set even more ambitious targets. The report advocated for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, recommended halving global emissions by 2030 and achieving net zero by 2050, as well as transitioning strongly to renewable energy sources and reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Its most recent assessment report was in 2021/2022, and it provided the most detailed and comprehensive analysis of climate science to date. It stressed that climate crisis is worsening faster than previously thought and highlighted that immediate action is essential to prevent catastrophic consequences. It called for global emissions to peak by 2025 at the latest, with a reduction of at least 43% by 2030 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, warning that failure to do so would lead to devastating effects for all regions, especially those most vulnerable. Crucially, to bring us back to the limitations that we looked at, it can't enforce anything on governments on the international community, and it's very unlikely that global emissions are going to peak by 2025, which really illustrates its limitations. Because this is a body of science that's saying what's needed scientifically. That doesn't mean it's going to translate into policy, especially if it goes up against states' interests, which is something realists would say. So that's the first key international framework and organisation. The second and arguably more important one is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has a quite long and annoying thing you've often got to call in your essays, the UNFCCC. So remember all three of those C's. It was established in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit and became the first global framework for addressing climate change, recognising it as a shared problem that requires coordinated action. With 198 parties, it has near universal membership, demonstrating the kind of a broad international agreement that tackling the climate crisis is important, even if that action sometimes isn't there. It crucially serves as a key international forum for climate change, setting the framework for how countries address climate change through regular conferences, which are the COPs, the conferences of the parties, which is where countries come together annually and seek to negotiate new agreements and achieve new commitments to tackling climate change. It doesn't mandate specific emissions reduction targets, but encourages countries to create their own goals and report their emissions, which we saw in the Paris Agreement. And it's been crucial to major protocols and agreements which have come out of the COP, such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Crucially, it can be seen as really significant because through the regular COP meetings, it has institutionalised climate discussions, ensuring that climate change remains a top priority on the international agenda because there are these annual meetings. These meetings have facilitated the signing of international agreements, as I said, and also created mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund to support developing countries in both mitigating and adapting to climate change. Finally, it's also established systems for countries to report their emissions and climate actions, fostering greater transparency. And this regular reporting helps to hold countries accountable and enables the global community to monitor progress. So, for example, Japan received significant criticism after scaling back its emission targets in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, as it increased reliance on fossil fuels, moving away from nuclear power. And this led to calls from the UN and environmental groups for Japan to revisit its climate strategy, showing how the UNFCCC, through its emphasis on reporting, can create some pressure on states to tackle climate change more ambitiously. Despite its achievements, it's faced significant challenges, though, particularly with the IPCC, due to its reliance on voluntary commitments by national governments. So it lacks the power to enforce emissions reductions, instead relying on voluntary commitments, which has led to uneven compliance among states, including the most powerful states in the world. Its approach to climate responsibility has often also been challenged by divergence between the developed and developing nations, which we'll have a look at in the next video. And crucially, the Green Climate Fund, when initially launched, has often fallen short of the 100 billion annual target and took too long to meet it. That's actually now been extended to 300 billion, as we'll look at COP29 later in the video. And again, it's a very ambitious target that potentially seems unlikely to be met, given the previous failure of the developed nations to meet their targets on time. They're supposed to meet this by 2020, and they didn't. Okay, what we're going to have a look at now is the key international agreements to tackle climate change that have already come out of the UNFCCC. These have been signed to try and get the international community and countries within the international community to respond urgently to the escalating threat of climate change. They often set emissions reductions and seek to foster international cooperation and urgency. The first key one of these was the Rio Earth Summit, officially known as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which took place in Rio in 1992. It brought together representatives from 178 countries and looked at climate change, biodiversity loss, and deforestation. Crucially, it was the first major international commitment to sustainable development, and it established foundational frameworks that shaped climate policy ever since. So it created a non-binding action plan to promote sustainable development globally, Agenda 21. It created the UNFCCC, which was really, really important, and which has then influenced subsequent environmental agreements, and also set out for the first time the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which, if you can bring in to your essays, can be a really good thing to bring in, particularly in relation to the difference between and the debate between developed and developing countries. And this principle ultimately recognised that developed nations were historically responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore they should lead in addressing climate change and have more ambitious climate commitments compared to developing nations. While it was really instrumental in setting up these frameworks, its measures were largely aspirational, and actual implementation has been mixed. But it was really important in setting the frameworks that resulted in subsequent agreements as well. The first one of these subsequent agreements was the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted in 1997 as an international treaty, marking the first time that countries agreed to binding, and crucially it was legally binding, greenhouse gas emission targets. It set legally binding targets for industrialized nations only, building on this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, reflecting the principle that they bear the primary responsibility for historical emissions. It came into force in 2005 after achieving ratification by a sufficient number of countries. So, its key measures included, as I mentioned, binding emission targets for developed nations. So it required 37 industrialized countries, including EU members, Japan and Canada, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 5% below 1990 levels during the first commitment period, which was 2008 to 2012. It established mechanisms like carbon trading and the Clean Development Mechanism, allowing countries to earn credits by investing in emissions reduction projects in developing countries. That's kind of a capitalist mechanism to try and kind of intervention to try and reduce emissions. And in 2012, the protocol was extended with a second commitment period under the Doha Amendment. However, this saw lower levels of engagement, with major emitters, including the US, Canada, and Japan, either withdrawing or not taking on new targets. Despite its really ambitious design with legally binding targets for developed states, it faced significant limitations in practice, especially as developed states struggled to meet their emissions targets and resented the fact that countries like China and India, which in the present day have very significant emissions, were exempt. Several major emitters, including crucially the United States, declined to ratify the treaty, which weakened its impact. So the Senate declined to ratify the treaty, whilst countries like Canada and Japan withdrew after failing to meet their targets. While some nations, such as the EU, Russia, and Japan, did achieve reductions beyond their targets, that was initially for Japan before it withdrew from its targets after the Fukushima disaster, global emissions continued to rise overall. And its limited scope and lack of inclusion of developing countries like China and India led to criticism that was insufficient to address the global scale of the climate crisis. After the Kyoto Protocol came the Copenhagen Accord, which came out of COP15, which initially intended and sought to create legally binding commitments for all countries, a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. However, there were significant disagreements between developed and developing nations, particularly over emission targets and financial commitments, which led to a non-binding agreement instead. And the accord was brokered by a small number of major economies, including the US, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Key measures included that it was the first agreement to set a 2-degree target, laying a benchmark for future negotiations, and it set non-binding emissions targets and encouraged countries to set their own emissions reduction targets and report on them, but not establishing legally binding commitments, as I mentioned. There was also a commitment to climate finance, so including the commitment for developed countries to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020, leading to the creation of the Green Climate Fund, as we previously mentioned. And it also introduced a system for countries to report their emissions and climate actions, with provisions for international consultation and analysis to improve transparency. It led to mixed follow-through, as with the Kyoto Protocol, highlighting the difficulties of achieving global action on climate change, particularly when the emissions targets aren't legally binding. So many countries set emissions targets, but the lack of enforcement mechanisms meant there was no direct consequences for failing to meet these goals. So you saw Japan set an ambitious target but failed to meet it. Australia, for example, proposed a target to reduce emissions to 5% below 2000 levels by 2020. However, it failed to meet this target due to a continued reliance on coal, and its emissions in fact increased by 20%, showing the complete failure of the Copenhagen Accord in relation to Australia. And crucially, developed states have consistently failed to meet the $100 billion climate finance target by a long way. In 2013, they collectively provided and mobilized approximately $52 billion, failing significantly with the $100 billion target annually set for 2020, and by 2020 it still hadn't met this target. The most recent and important one you're going to use most in your essays agreement then is the Paris Agreement from 2015, which is adopted at COP21. It's one of the most ambitious international climate agreements to date, with near universal participation. And unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which focused solely on developing nations, and it kind of carried on from the Copenhagen Accord and requires all countries to take part in emissions reductions efforts. Its main goal was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees, which the IPCC identified as critical for avoiding the most severe climate impacts. Key measures. The most important measure was nationally determined contributions, where each country submits its own climate action plan, known as an NDC, detailing its emission reductions targets and strategies, and countries are encouraged to revise and strengthen the NDCs every 5 years. So again, they're not legally binding, but it's really encouraging for each country to set their own targets to really reflect their own national economies, with of course an encouragement for them to be ambitious. It also includes a global stocktake every 5 years, so the first of those was in 2020, assessing collective progress towards meeting goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or below 2 degrees. It reaffirmed the commitment to mobilising $100 billion a year for developing nations, and also supported the importance of adaptation measures, and the concept of loss and damage, acknowledging that certain impacts of climate change, particularly in vulnerable nations, may be irreversible. This led to discussions about compensation for affected countries, many of which, for example, are island nations that may lose a significant amount of their land or completely go underwater. Whilst, of course, the Paris Agreement inspired many countries to set ambitious targets, progress again has been inconsistent. So often rhetoric is very strong and the rhetoric of agreements is very ambitious, but the action just simply doesn't meet that ambition. The first global stocktake, sorry, I thought it was in 2020, it was actually in 2023, revealed that the world is not on track to meet the 1.5 degree target. In fact, it's currently on track to reach 3.1 degrees rise in temperatures by the end of the century. Major emitters, including the US and China, have faced challenges in aligning their policies with necessary emissions targets. So China is the world's largest current emitter of of greenhouse gases. It pledged to peak its carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve neutrality by 2060, but it continues to rely on coal-fired power plants. And while it's invested in renewable energy, the pace of transition has been insufficient, and it's continued to build new coal power plants, which suggests it's unlikely to meet its quite ambitious targets. Domestically, you're saying very difficult. Domestic policies mean very impactful in the United States in particular. So it rejoined the Paris Agreement in 2021 after it was left under Trump, and set ambitious targets to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. But it's encountered obstacles, particularly the growing demands of AI that have significantly disrupted supply, and in particular, as they're the growing energy demands of AI. Not only is that likely to continue due to the kind of growing competition between China and the US and the importance of AI to that, Trump has now come in, or is coming in for a second term. It looks likely he'll leave the Paris Agreement again, and he's really backed using domestic energy production, so greater drilling, greater oil, greater use of US natural gas reserves in order to meet these growing demands of AI in particular. So that really looks like the domestic political considerations and the fact that there's a president again coming in who effectively doesn't believe in climate change is really going to make difficult the US's commitments under the Paris Agreement. Additionally, the $100 billion annual finance goal for developing countries wasn't met until 2022, 2 years later than the original 2020 target, highlighting the ongoing difficulties in mobilizing climate finance. Okay, what we're going to have a look at now is the strengths and weaknesses of international agreements, starting with some arguments that international agreements are effective. The first one of these is that they've been crucial in facilitating global commitment to climate change. They've been essential in building consensus and formalising the commitment from the international community to tackling climate change. You could cite the Paris Climate Agreement there, which brought together 194 countries, including major emitters like the United States, China, and India, to really seek to bring down global warming to well below 2 degrees and set important and ambitious national determined contributions of their own. The Paris Agreement has also provided a platform for vulnerable nations to advocate for the 1.5 degrees target, which is crucial for their survival in the face of rising sea levels. Whilst additionally, the 2021 COP26 conference saw 190 countries agreeing to phase down coal, and there was actually a commitment to phase out coal in the 2024 COP29 conference, and 130 countries pledging to halt deforestation by 2030, both landmark commitments. They've brought countries together to put together really ambitious, important commitments to reducing climate change. They've also influenced national policies and held countries accountable. So they've influenced domestic climate policies and embedded global goals into national legislative frameworks. In particular, national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement push countries to develop, refine, and increasingly make more ambitious their climate strategies. And that's where countries are held to account also through global stocktakes. In the UK, the Climate Change Act 2008 was strongly influenced by the Kyoto Protocol and subsequent agreements setting a legal requirement for carbon budgeting and emissions reductions. It's made the UK the first country in the world to adopt legally binding emissions targets, inspiring similar legislation in countries like Sweden and New Zealand, who also committed then to net zero commitments by 2050. The European Union's Green New Deal is another example of how the Paris Agreement has driven ambitious policy reform, in this case in the Paris Agreement. And it commits EU member states to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, with intermediate targets to cut emissions by at least 55% by 2030. So that really shows that agreements not only are important for their own sake, they've also led to really ambitious domestic policies from countries domestically and also regional organisations to tackle climate change. Finally, they've also addressed the need for developed states to help developing states financially to tackle climate change. They've placed a strong emphasis on the historical responsibility of developed nations and the kind of common but differentiated responsibilities principle to support developing countries in mitigating and adapting to climate change impacts. So the Paris Agreement reaffirmed the $100 billion annual kind of commitment from developed countries to assist developing nations, which has been impactful in financing projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it was met in 2022 when developed countries provided and mobilised a total of $115.9 billion in climate finance for developing countries. In Morocco, the GCF funded a $98 million project to develop the world's largest concentrated solar power plant, whilst in Bangladesh, it's invested $40 million in a project to build cyclone-resilient infrastructure and improve early warning systems for communities at risk from extreme weather events. These programs are really essential for empowering developing nations to create locally relevant climate solutions, and really shows how international agreements have supported the necessity of developed nations and richer nations supporting developing states to help them tackle climate change. On the other hand, there are some really important arguments that international agreements aren't effective and haven't been effective in tackling climate change. First of all, crucially, they've lacked enforcement mechanisms and haven't been ambitious enough. So a significant limitation, including of the Paris Agreement, is the absence of strong enforcement mechanisms to ensure that countries follow their targets, and crucially the emissions reductions targets included in these international agreements. Whilst they encourage countries to set emission targets, there are no binding consequences for non-compliance, and that often results in non-compliance and countries missing their targets often by a significant way. And this is seen in the Paris Agreement, where you have national determined contributions, then countries aren't legally bound to meet them. And the Kyoto Protocol, even when it contained legally binding targets in theory, suffered from a lack of engagement, as major emitters like the United States refused to ratify it, and some countries, even if they were legally binding targets, simply didn't meet them. This has contributed to a global climate response that is insufficiently ambitious. So current NDCs place the world on a trajectory for a 2.7 degrees to 3.1 degrees rise in temperatures by the end of the century, far above the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree target the IPCC have emphasised is really important to meet. Additionally, the voluntary nature of these targets has allowed some countries to set insufficiently ambitious goals. For example, under its additional nationally determined contribution, Brazil committed to reducing emissions by 37% by 2025, but has since weakened enforcement of all environmental protections, leading to increased deforestation in the Amazon. So the global climate response has thus been hampered by a structure that relies on goodwill from countries rather than enforceable commitments. And without mechanisms to hold countries accountable much stronger within these international agreements, they're unlikely to be effective at all. As kind of reference, many countries have failed to meet their targets under these international agreements. For example, you see Canada and Australia under the Copenhagen Accord were really unsuccessful. So Australia, I've mentioned this example before, committed to reducing emissions by 5% from 2000 levels by 2020, but it actually resulted in continued high emissions by this time, making it one of the highest per capita emitters globally. And it simply failed to reduce those emissions. Even under the Paris Agreement, where countries are kind of setting their own targets, there are substantial gaps in meeting those commitments. China pledged to kind of peak its emissions before 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060, yet it continues to approve new coal-fired power plants. whilst the US has really been hampered from meeting its targets due to changes in domestic politics, particularly with Trump, who's effectively a climate denier. The failure of these major emitters in particular to align with the stated goals reflect the challenges of relying on voluntary targets, which can be easily adjusted or ignored without legal repercussions. And finally, a final key argument is that developed states haven't supported developing states as much as promised. International agreements have consistently emphasised the need for developed states to support developing nations financially in climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, but this support has fallen short of expectations. Developed nations pledged to mobilise $100 billion annually in climate finance by 2020, but this target was repeatedly missed. In 2019, only $79.6 billion was mobilised, leaving a $20 billion gap, and this target was eventually met in 2022, but the inconsistency and delays have strained trust between nations. Furthermore, it can be argued that these commitments are nowhere near enough. In 2021, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, called out developing countries to their limited commitments, arguing that climate finance must go beyond the $100 billion pledge to address most mitigation and adaptation adequately. Recently, as we'll look at the most recent COP29 in 2024, there was a much greater, stronger commitment to $300 billion. But again, is this going to be met? I think it's right to be sceptical given how developed nations have failed to meet these commitments on time in the past. And the previous commitment of $100 billion was a lot less ambitious. Okay, linking into that, what we're going to have a look at now is some recent conferences and developments. First, looking at some recent COPs, so 3 important recent COPs. And the first one of these was COP21, which was held in Glasgow. It was one of the most high-profile climate conferences in recent years. Key outcomes included the Glasgow Climate Pact, where countries agreed to phase down coal usage. They were going to say phase out. There was a last-minute compromise that drew criticism, but underscored the need for reducing coal reliance. This is the first time that coal was mentioned in a COP agreement, which was significant. There were enhanced climate finance agreements, with the reiteration of the $100 billion climate finance pledge, an agreement to double adaptation finance for developing countries by 2025. And after years of negotiation, there were also finalised rules for carbon markets, enabling countries to trade emissions reductions and offering incentive for carbon reduction projects in developing countries. It did mark a significant step forward, particularly with the formal inclusion of coal in COP negotiations, but the language, of course, was weakened, which can be seen as a limitation. Additionally, it saw a record presence of fossil fuel industry representatives, with over 500 lobbyists from coal, oil and gas companies registered for the conference, outnumbering delegations from individual countries. And this was criticised for potentially weakening the commitments made at COP26. Despite this, the kind of finalising rules for carbon markets under Article 6 was important. That had been unresolved since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and that could potentially be really impactful. You then had COP28 in 2023, which was held in Dubai. It was a critical conference as it coincided with the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, which are held every 5 years. The stocktake assessed the collective progress of countries towards the agreement's goals, with findings indicating that current policies are vastly and greatly insufficient to meet the 1.5 degree target. So the stocktake revealed that existing NDCs and national policies were putting the world on track for at least a 2.7 degree rise in temperatures by the end of the century, and this emphasised the urgent need for countries to strengthen their climate commitments. It reaffirmed the 1.5 degree goal and also explored climate finance solutions, including different blended finance initiatives and partnerships with private investors to help meet adaptation and mitigation needs in developing countries. The results of the global stocktake were as a kind of stark warning for the world, and it provided a clear benchmark for future climate action with the recommitment to the 1.5 degree target. Again, there was a significant presence of fossil fuel industry representatives, with the host, the UAE, being a major oil producer as well, and the involvement of industry representatives sparked criticism from fossil fuel interest might hinder progress on establishing stronger language, as it did in COP 26 in 2021. And critics argued that without strict mechanisms to phase out fossil fuels, financing alone wouldn't be insufficient to meet the climate goals. The most recent COP then, which was actually only held a month or two ago in Baku, was COP29 in 2024. Key outcomes included strengthened national commitments from some countries, with revised national determined contributions, for example, from the United Kingdom. Finally, there was language in an open letter of explicitly phasing out fossil fuels, not just coal, rather than just phasing them down. And crucially, the Adaptation Fund was expanded, with developed nations agreeing to provide at least $300 billion annually to developing countries by 2035 to support their efforts in dealing with climate change, which is a kind of significant increase on the previous $100 billion annual commitment. So this is quite a significant COP, actually, even if it maybe in the UK didn't receive as much media attention as COP21, because of course COP21 was hosted in Glasgow. So on the one hand, it can be seen as important. You saw for the first time that language of phasing down all fossil fuels, and the expansion of the Adaptation Fund, which was much needed. This being said, again, both these commitments were non-binding, and there's been a long history of countries and the international community failing to meet its commitments, especially non-binding ones. The conference also didn't set a binding global deadline for fossil fuel phase-out or introduce enforceable mechanisms to ensure countries honour their strengthened NDCs, which is seen by activists as essential to meeting the 1.5-degree goal. So there's some key recent COPs. One of them we're going to have a look at is some important developments to international efforts to tackle climate change. The first of these is the withdrawal, re-engagement and re-withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement. So it joined under President Obama, which were drawn under Donald Trump's first presidency. Joe Biden took office and re-entered the Paris Agreement, introducing new climate policies, including the Inflation Reduction Act, which invested billions in clean energy and emissions reduction. It looks again, with Trump's re-election, that the US is going to pull out again. And that really shows how domestic politics and changes in domestic politics, especially when domestic politicians don't believe in climate change, can really hamper the international community's efforts to tackle climate change, especially when it's such an important and major emitter like the United States. The inclusion of loss and damage in the COP negotiations reflects the growing pressure from vulnerable nations for compensation for irreversible climate impacts. So there's a loss and damage fund at COP27, which is established, which recognises that developed nations, historically responsible for much of climate change, have a duty to support countries suffering the most, and the fund provides financial support to countries that are disproportionately affected by severe climate impacts, such as extreme weather events and rising sea levels. There's also been acceleration of renewable energy investment in recent years, the past decade in particular, with countries like China, the US and India rapidly increasing their renewable energy capacity, with China really leading the way in solar and wind energy installation. So the International Renewable Energy Agency reported a record $500 billion in global renewable energy investments in 2022 alone, for example. And there's also been a growing importance of the civil society and private sector, with civil society and particularly grassroots movements, such as figures like Greta Thunberg, really putting pressure on governments and the international community to tackle climate change, and the private sector also increasingly collaborating with nation states to tackle climate change. And that's what we're actually going to finally look at, which is the efforts of other organisations and groups to tackle climate change, rather than international organisations and national governments. The first of these is regional organisations. So the European Union has been really proactive in addressing climate change, with its European Green Deal aiming for net zero emissions by 2050, and it's a really ambitious target. It's implemented binding climate legislation, including the European Climate Law, which requires member states to collectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And it's actually exceeded, as a result, earlier targets. And this reflects a kind of how regional organisations can really be very ambitious and set legally binding targets, which are actually legally binding because they're a regional organisation, and EU law is effectively higher law, as we'll look at when we look at the EU in more detail. for their member states. And this has been kind of facilitated in part by the implementation of policies like the EU emissions trading system, which is the world's largest carbon market. The African Union has also adopted climate change frameworks focusing on climate adaptation and sustainable development. Programs like the African Adaptation Initiative and the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative play crucial roles in helping African countries tackle climate challenges that disproportionately really do impact the continent. So, for example, the African Renewable Energy Initiative seeks to expand renewable energy generation on the continent, with a goal to add at least 300 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. That really shows how, again, like the European Union, regional organisations can bring countries together on a continent to really seek to tackle climate change. And you see similar in ASEAN as well, where the Climate Change Initiative encourages member states to develop and implement national climate pacts that align with regional goals. One of ASEAN's key commitments is to increase renewable energy share in regional energy mix to 23% by 2025. And crucially, also ASEAN and both ASEAN and the African Union have represented countries which historically have represented their member states which historically haven't been responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions in international organisations and negotiations as well. The next key kind of group is global civil society, and really important to that has actually been youth climate movements. So figures like Greta Thunberg and her Fridays for Future movement have united millions of people, young people worldwide, demanding urgent and ambitious climate policies. Since Thunberg's first climate strike in 2018, it's inspired over 14 million participants in more than 7,500 cities across 125 countries in the world. The movement leveraged social media and organised public demonstrations, and has been impactful in influencing the public debate and countries and companies to have more ambitious climate commitments. In Germany, for example, the movement influenced the government's decision to set earlier deadlines for coal phase-out and stricter emissions targets. Environmental NGOs are also important, such as Greenpeace, the World Wildlife Fund, and Friends of the Earth, which have kind of for a long time been at the forefront of climate advocacy. Greenpeace led high-profile campaigns against deforestation in the Amazon, and for example, in 2021, Friends of the Earth, alongside other NGOs, won a landmark legal case against Royal Dutch Shell. With a Dutch court ordering the company to cut its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030, setting a global precedent for holding corporations legally accountable for their climate impacts. So it shows a bit of a different method they've used for pressuring fossil fuel companies. And finally, some foundations and philanthropists have put a lot of money into contributing to tackling climate change. For example, Bloomberg has committed over $500 million through his kind of Beyond Coal campaign to phase out coal plants in the United States, resulting in the retirement of over 60% of US coal plants since 2010. Finally, there are some other organisations or groups, so the C40 cities, climate leadership groups bringing together 100 of the world's largest cities committing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including London, New York and Tokyo, which have all committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So it's not just a national layer of government or international negotiations and commitments, there's also lower down at the level of cities and more local government. And you see that in London, for example, through ULEZ, which though it's been controversial for Sadiq Khan to introduce, has clearly reflected a real commitment and a real ambitious commitment to tackling climate change and reducing London's emissions. And finally, development banks and regional financial institutions are also important, such as the Asian Development Bank, which have played an important role in financing climate projects across Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific. They not only support renewable energy, but also fund adaptation projects, such as flood control systems and drought-resistant agriculture, which are really important to adapting to the most harsh impacts of climate change. So yeah, that was a very long video, but hopefully that gives you a lot more detail on the organisations, agreements, and recent developments in action to tackle climate change. I'm just going to scroll up to the questions to show you how you could use some of those. So, evaluate the view that global environmental governance has been effective. You could potentially do a paragraph on international agreements. or international organisations like you can bring in the IPCC and the UNFCCC there and bring in some of the arguments about whether international agreements are effective or not effective. And of course, you're going to bring in lots of evidence and examples into any question you get on environmental global governance. And you can also bring in the stuff we looked at on the UNFCCC and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change into a possible 12 marker, while some of this other content could also definitely come in. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.